Okay, let us get going. Good morning and a very warm welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us. This is the CoMoUK seminar, workshop, event, etc. on future rural mobility. The timeliness of this is that the Department for Transport, we're really pleased to see, has a call for evidence out about rural mobility. That closes on the 16th of this month. So we thought this would be good timing to bring us all together and have a debate on what the DFT should be focusing on, what evidence we should be providing to it. I'm really pleased that we can take a rural focus with this. We all know that urban and suburban issues get a lot of focus in the transport sector, rural somewhat less so. So I think this is a great opportunity. We have a great lineup of speakers, and advance thanks to all of them. I've been briefing them to stick to 3 minutes each, and I will pop up on video in a sort of passive-aggressive, lingering fashion if I think we're going too much beyond the 3. After each little cluster of speakers, so we have a sustainable transport NGO cluster, and then Rob Dickin from Transport for the South East on behalf of authorities interested in this space, and then from operators. So after each of those, we'll have time for a little bit of Q&A on what they've been saying and thoughts that's given us all. And then we will split out into breakout rooms. All the breakout rooms are the same content, but we just want to have a few of them to be at the right kind of scale and be able to have an in-depth discussion. We'll be using Miro boards, for those of you familiar with that, on many of these such things through 2020 and 2021. No explanation needed, but it's electronic post-its basically. So really good to to get all your thoughts in there. We will of course be submitting our response to this call for evidence. It's a really important area of work for us in the shared transport sector. And this will, of course, help us in doing that too. So to set the scene just briefly, and then I will introduce Claire Gregory from the Department of Transport, whom I'm delighted to say is talking, and whom I've allowed a little bit more than the 3 minutes. We take shared transport in rural areas very seriously. We work in depth on this, particularly in Scotland, but not just. I'd like us to work more on these issues at CoMoUK. I think the core themes are quite well reflected actually in the DFT's call for evidence: reducing dependence on the private car, access to key services and to employment, cutting social inclusion. There's quite a lot of stake here, and I think there's a big picture point as well about the decarbonising changes to transport this country needs to see and is seeing on the ground to an extent. Can't just be confined to non-rural areas. Surely that is just starkly unfair and unworkable. We know it's really important to not just reduce emissions per car, but also reduce the number of cars we need and the total mileage driven. Shared transport's got a big role in that. Public transport's got a big role in that. Community transport's got a big role in that, and that's why we're hearing from speakers coming from those angles. So I do encourage you obviously to respond to the call for evidence yourselves, and this is going to be very helpful to us. Thank you. Claire, could I turn to you to help set the scene? Put a bit more evidence, and then we can move to our speakers. Good morning. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for having me here today. A special thank you to Richard and CoMoUK for hosting this event, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion today. As Richard mentioned, my name is Claire Gregory, and I'm head of the Future Transport Strategy team at the Department for Transport. I thought it'd be helpful to open up with a short overview on our work to date in developing the rural strategy. So just to give a bit of background to our program, the Future Transport Program, we were previously known as the Future Mobility Program until last year. So we're recognising that we're seeing mega trends of electrification, increasing connectivity, automation, real-time data collection, and data analysis that are driving the development of new modes for travel for both people and for goods. So our Future of Transport programme aims to secure the UK's position as a world leading innovator to create a greener and more inclusive transport system. The programme was set up as part of the Industrial Strategy Grand Challenges back in 2017. A programme that spans both the Department for Transport, so we want to make sure that any innovation is good for the transport system as a whole, focusing on outcomes such as leading the transition to zero emissions, increasing accessibility and inclusivity of the transport network, easing congestion, increasing safety, all of those things. But also joint unit with BEIS, so also want to ensure that these technologies are developed and exported from the UK, and also a bit of focus on building the skills base to support the development and implementation of these technologies. So where are we at with our rural strategy so far? So in 2019, we published our urban strategy, which set out how we would approach innovation in cities, maximising the opportunities and minimising the risks to the transport system. We looked at the urban area first because we realised that's where innovation was hitting fastest, but we also recognised the importance of rural mobility as well, and included a commitment to taking options forward for a rural strategy. So over the past year, we've started engaging with a range of stakeholders, and I'm sure there's many of you in this virtual room, to understand what some of the opportunities and challenges facing rural areas in terms of transport innovation. This culminated in publishing our call for evidence in November, with a view to publishing a full strategy later down the track. So what's going to be our main focus through the strategy? As I mentioned earlier, we focused on urban areas first because that's where changes were happening fastest. But we recognise that there's not the same market forces within rural areas, and we really want to make sure that the benefits of innovation can reach small towns and more remote areas as well. So we really want to, through the strategy, explore how future transport solutions and interventions can tackle rural mobility issues and improve connectivity and accessibility, increase the low carbon travel options, and deliver more integrated transport services. And at the heart of it, we also want to ensure that new transport innovations are inclusive and practical for all who live in villages, towns, and more isolated locations. And recognizing doing that no two communities are alike. I thought I'd just mention it's kind of the elephant in the room when we're talking about this, or maybe not so much at the moment, but recognize that we're working within current restrictions with COVID. So kind of want to think about how some of these things might affect longer term trends that we're seeing at the moment. So recognizing that there has been a shift towards more greater use of the private vehicle, and having to think about how that might impact behaviour longer term. But I think on the flip side, recognising some of the opportunities from innovation that we've seen rising out of the pandemic as well, such as use of drones to deliver medical supplies to the Isle of Wight, for example. Just to note here as well that the strategy is building on other work that has gone. Richard mentioned the transport decarbonisation plan, also working with the walking and cycling team as well, with the plan that they delivered last year, work going on with the buses team too, and also other parts of the Future of Transport programme. So for example, our ongoing regulatory review and work that we're doing with the Connected Places Catapult and understanding the skills pipeline required over the next decade or so. So within our call for evidence, the aim of this is to gain insight from stakeholders about what you think should underpin and be included within our strategy. So our call for evidence looks at three main areas. So the first being the context of rural areas. So thinking about the key trends that we're seeing, both in terms of things like demographics and geography, which affect transport provision, and some of the common issues in rural areas that the transport system can help address, such as access to key services, education and employment. So we're interested to understand if you have evidence for these trends, or if there's important trends that we're missing as well and you would like to see included in the strategy. The second is an assessment of the trends that we're seeing in transport innovation. So we've identified a number of key trends in the document. We're interested to know if these are kind of the right trends to focus on, or if there's any others that we should also focus on. So this includes things like increase in the use of active modes, how innovation such as around digital mapping can help with walking and cycling. We've also seen some of our e-scooter trials currently in more rural locations such as Norfolk and Great Yarmouth, among other areas. We're also seeing more effective integration of journeys through applications such as mobility as a service, thinking about how they can help integrate different services within rural areas. We're seeing digital models offering greater flexibility in services, and we're seeing that with demand responsive transport. Some good examples of that popping up. Also thinking more ahead to modes that are maybe a little bit more on the horizon, such as self-driving cars. So thinking about how we can ensure that we're taking into consideration rural issues, so that when those technologies are deployed, they can work for rural areas as well. And the third key area that we're looking at through the call for evidence is the approach that government should take to help shape these opportunities. So our urban strategy, at the heart of it, had principles to guide the development of innovation in cities. We're wanting to advice on whether we should continue that approach for rural areas, and if so, do those principles set out in the urban strategy apply to rural areas as well, or should we be thinking about other things too? Also interested to hear about approaches to testing and trialling in rural areas, and also the roles for government, subnational bodies and local authorities, and how government can encourage the private sector to get involved in rural areas as well. So just note that through this call for evidence, we're interested in any form of evidence is welcome. So it can include things like case studies, other data sets that you may have been collecting, basically anything we're interested to hear about. And as Richard mentioned, the call for evidence closes on the 16th of February. So just to close out, I'm really excited to hear more about what we've got to say in the following talks, and also in the breakout groups as well. And thank you again, everybody, for taking the time out to join today.
Super. Thank you so much, Claire. And we'll be able to dive in the breakout rooms into specific aspects which are heavily influenced by the call for evidence itself. I will now move us on to our NGO cluster. So this is powered by a relationship we at CoMo and all these other organizations have helped set up, called the Sustainable Transport Alliance. This is a grouping of sustainable transport NGOs that is coming together around some common principles and represents interests across the community, shared, public transport and active travel spaces, recognizing that we have so much common ground between our agendas, and that the right times and opportunities, for example, the forthcoming COP26 conference in Glasgow later this year, it is helpful around more than some of the parts to come together and stress those common points. So in that spirit, we have no less than 3 fellow chief execs, and I would like to start with Jules Townsend, Chief Executive of the Community Rail Network. Jules, over to you. Thank you.
Hi everyone, and thank you to CoMo for having me today. This is going to be, as Richard says, a very quick fire look at how community rail is impacting on rural mobility. and perhaps more importantly, how we can draw on the lessons from Community Rail to think about how communities can be engaged in creating more inclusive and sustainable mobility across all of our rural areas. So we are a national not-for-profit organisation working to support and champion more than 70 community rail partnerships around Britain and more than 1,000 station friends groups. So these are community-based partnerships and volunteer groups working in lots of different ways to engage local people with their railways and stations and helping communities to derive as much benefit as possible from their local rail network. And there's a particular concentration of community rail in rural areas, although we are seeing more and more activities springing up in urban places too. And of course, a lot of community rail is about how we connect these different locations. Just to give you an idea of the sorts of activities that community rail delivers, it includes working very closely with our rail industry partners, providing advice on local needs and opportunities, and helping the rail industry to be more community-minded in its approach. It includes all manner of activities to bring people together, promote social inclusion and well-being, often using stations as a focal point for local engagement, and in turn promoting pride and positivity in relation to the station and the railway. It includes promoting rail as a part of sustainable travel and tourism, and working with local groups to help overcome specific mobility barriers and to build confidence around rail use. And it includes working to join rail up better with buses and community transport, walking, cycling, shared transport schemes, etc. So it's very much a place-based approach, a bottom-up approach driven by a desire within communities to make a difference locally and engage with local transport, albeit supported by the rail industry. So it's all about working with and not against local people and local identities. And it's an approach that works. We've got evidence that railway lines with community rail partnerships perform better in terms of passenger numbers, in terms of their use. Lots of evidence about community rail impacting on individuals' mobility and mobility horizons, and a growing range of fantastic examples of stations being transformed, not just aesthetically, but in terms of how they connect up with local communities and serve local communities. And the approach aligns really well with a lot of research, looking at how we can promote more sustainable transport behaviours and more sustainable forms of development in transport. I think put simply, when communities are engaged and empowered and enabled to lead change, it leads to innovation. It leads to solutions that work on the ground and that local people buy into and make good use of. So it naturally affects attitudes and behaviours and builds local positivity around public transport and sustainable mobility. And we suggest that approach is exactly what's needed in rural areas to overcome the major challenges that have been identified through the DfT's consultation, to do with car dependency, to do with transport inequalities, and indeed the major challenges that we face right now as a result of the pandemic. But of course, for us to unleash the greater power of communities, there is a lot we need to do. There's a lot of joined up working that we need to do. So we're looking forward to today's discussion. We hope it's going to be useful in considering the opportunities for working together to empower communities better in rural areas, and I hope we can focus in on these really critical issues around the human and social side of change, acknowledging that technology probably doesn't have all the answers, but just maybe with the right support, communities do. And I hope that leads on really nicely to Bill's quick pitch, which is coming up next.
Thank you, Jules, and thanks to Richard and everyone at CoMoUK for inviting me along this morning. 3 quick things about community transport to get us all on the same page. Run by charities, community groups, other not-for-profit entities, all with a view to providing services that are for a social purpose and community benefit, tends to use smaller vehicles and tends to be demand responsive, with the exception of community buses. And we've got pretty much got coverage in every local authority area. There'll be some kind of community transport going on in its various forms across England. Three thoughts on the call for evidence and the development of a rural transport strategy. Firstly, really welcoming the strategy, the acknowledgement that there needs to be a focus on accessibility and social inclusion in a strategy for rural transport. I think clearly many people in rural areas do have significant agency over how they travel, and can make choices. Invariably, that choice is the car because of the constraints around public transport and places people need to get to. But so much of what community transport does in rural areas actually supports people who don't have that kind of agency over how they travel and are often having transport provided to them. It's really important that we think about those groups and that type of provision as we develop a rural transport strategy. And if a strategy can't think about that type of provision and include it, then at least needs to do no harm to those organisations' ability to continue to provide those services. Second thing I want to say is to really make a plea that we're open-minded about what innovation is and where it can be found and how it can be tested. I think the consultation asks about how the private sector can be encouraged, but we wouldn't want to lose sight of the fact that there's many community-owned approaches, non-commercial approaches that are perhaps often more suited to the rural context and the way in which services need to be provided in areas where there may be sparse populations and people need to make multiple journeys for different reasons to access health services, access the shops, access leisure and work. So it's really important that we don't lose sight in the development of the strategy of that wider piece and don't just focus on what the private sector can do, as important as that is. We've shown through community transport that we can develop affordable, demand responsive transport, even when our core ridership is people who may have mobility difficulties and might live in sparsely populated areas. And if there was the opportunity through this strategy to think about, well, how do we strengthen and sustain that type of provision, that would be really good. We've seen that in the Welsh Government's integrated responsive transport strategy, where some of the pilot areas are being led by community transport operators, some being led by commercial, but it's all very much about providing new types of services in deep rural areas, and there's lots of success we can look at, and we'll present that evidence in our submission. Final thing I want to say is it's really important that we think broadly about joining lots of different things up. I think it would be a shame if the strategy just leads to extracting people from mass transit and community transport and other modes into commercial DRT services and doesn't get people out of cars and actually doesn't lead to a flourishing of different types of travel and the sustainability of those kind of shared modes and active travel. So, where do we look for this? Well, partly thinking about how does the Powers in the Bus Services Act read across to rural areas, because they were largely developed with metropolitan areas in mind. There may be some read across there, but also looking to things like total transport, which I know we piloted it, but I think it's an approach that still has much validity, thinking beyond passenger transport into that range of services that local authorities and the state already commissions, non-emergency patient transport, school transport, and trying to look at the bigger picture there around the range of activities that need to happen within transport in a rural context, and thinking about how can we make public resources go further by being a bit more collaborative in how we both commission and deliver services for rural communities. So I'll finish there. I'm going to pass on to Claire Walters from Bus Users UK. Thank you.
Hi all, and thanks again to CoMo for organising this. Obviously, Bill and Jules and I and a number of other people are all already working together on the sustainable transport Alliance, so I'm happy to echo pretty much everything they've said without repeating it, hopefully. Those of you who don't know Bus Users, that it's a small charity, and the mission of the charity is bring people together through accessible, inclusive transport. So clearly, this is a lifeline in rural areas, possibly even more than in urban areas. We all know that society is changing the way we work and shop and travel and socialise and access services and all the rest of it. And even before COVID, local authority funding for buses in particular was not really reflecting those changing needs. So urgent action is needed to pave the way for a more sustainable future. And we're very glad to see this this call for evidence come about, and we will be submitting something in minute detail, I'm afraid. Sorry about that in advance, the people have to read it. What concerns us most is that whenever you look at strategies and ways forward, we seem to end up with people calling for radical one-size-fits-all types ideas. So you've got people going renationalise, franchise, change everything. DRT is the only option. Community transport can do it all with no money. And obviously, some of these things, or a combination of those things in the main, will doubtless be the right response for some areas, but it's never going to be the right area, the right response for everywhere. So tailoring transport services to the needs of the particular community and groups of communities with very little in common on the upside, it's not looking like the easiest solution, but frankly, it's the only solution that will fit for the longer term. So echoing things that other people have said, while a national bus strategy is a great idea, what's really needed is a joined up transport strategy, one that takes account of all available transport modes, including active and shared travel, and is based on the expressed needs of the communities to be served. Easier said than done, we all think. So how do we find out what people want? Well, this is where bus users can help, and it's really not rocket science, we just ask them. We need to go and talk to people where they live and work, not just in town halls and civic buildings. We need to talk directly to the actual passengers on the buses, at railway stations, in schools, at hospitals, in shopping centres. I mean, obviously COVID's making that a bit tricky at the minute, but we can still do that, reaching out to people through local newspapers, local radio, social media, where that works, and find out what they really think. So we need also then, and this is the hard bit for the local authorities in particular, we need to take what they have to say seriously, however wild and wonderful some of the ideas are. And then when the decision makers come up with their plan, you need to explain why those ideas may or may not be feasible, so that people have actually believed that they've been heard. So we need to also then all work with people who really know about shared and active travel, not just other colleagues in our own industries. So that way we can offer a genuine alternative to the private car. From our point of view, this seems like the only way to develop a truly accessible and inclusive transport plan that actually serves the needs of the majority, if not all, the people who be using it. So that's where I'm coming from. I'm happy to get involved in discussion later. I will hand back to Richard.
Thank you so much, Claire. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Jules. So a little bit of time in the programme now for any questions on all you've just heard, any thoughts that has stirred up. I've been scribbling away and taking some very useful notes. And one purpose of the STA, existing Sustainable Transport Alliance, is that we, where we're in agreement, we take care to support each other's messages on opportunities like this, calls for evidence, consultations, etc. Because we realise that although we're actually often singing from a very similar hymn sheet, we weren't explicitly signposting that, which makes life a bit harder perhaps for government, for example, than it needs to be. So anyone wants to dive in, just unmute yourselves, come onto video if you would like to. I'll just pause here for a little bit, otherwise we'll move on with the programme. Thank you.
Hello, I'm looking for the raised hands function, but I can't find it. Can I just dive in with a question?
Please dive in.
Yeah, hi, I'm Alison Thorpe. I'm from the South Downs National Park Authority. Really glad to hear Claire Gregory at the beginning talking about all the other sort of functions of DFT that she's going to be liaising with on the strategy. One of the things that we come against in national parks is the speeds on rural roads that I think are a real deterrent to other forms of transport. I mean, they're a deterrent to cyclists. They are going to be a deterrent to things like shared e-scooters or micro vehicles that aren't traveling at the same speeds. And it's we have to have, I think years ago, there was a real kind of quiet lanes drive to and a desire to do that, and I'm not really seeing that from DFT anymore, and it'd be good to have to sort of factor that in, because we need to change the speeds on rural roads to enable some of the other alternative forms of transport. We also need, I think, to get HGVs out of rural roads where we can. So the idea of sort of transporting goods in a different way is of interest. So as more of a comment, really, that DFT work with roads and look at how we use rural roads as part of this strategy.
Thank you, Alison. Undoubtedly, great point. And from the active travel perspective, as CoMoUK obviously works on bike share, which means we're part of a wider, constituency on cycling. I think the hostile environment that high speed limit roads, perhaps with poor sight lines, sharp corners, I mean, that's really the last thing you want to be experiencing as someone on a bike, or, as you say, e-scooters. Are the world of powered rideables, as they're called, is is expanding all the time. Grateful to get any thoughts from Claire, Jules, or Bill, and also, Alison, I wonder, is this is something that, as a national park authority, you're trying to do something about already, by the sounds of it. But I'm also imagining you have some barriers on that, so useful for us to know a bit more, perhaps.
Yeah, we've been talking to Cycling UK. We had a joint national parks bid into the Green Recovery Challenge Fund, and we were hoping to we weren't successful, but the concept is still something that we want to explore together with some AOMBs and with Cycling UK, to see if we can have some demonstration areas where we can start looking at things like road closures, permeable gateways, so only certain types of modes can go through. And it's about sort of identifying which roads, if you like, in which areas might be candidates for that kind of initiative. And but totally recognizing that it's about winning hearts and minds, because nobody wants to be parted from their God-given right to drive wherever they want in their private car. And we've all seen the challenges of the Emergency Active Travel Fund pop-up cycle lanes that have popped up and then popped right down again because of a sort of anti-cycling campaigns against them as soon as they appear. So it's but perhaps in some rural areas, if you can enable a different form of transport, you can win hearts and minds. But frankly, people are so used to not having choice that it's going to be a long journey when you present people with choice, I think.
Thank you. Yeah, certainly from shared transport experience, I think it's vital, obviously, that there is provision and people do adopt that. There are people who vaguely embrace it and so on. However, provision itself is necessary but not sufficient, I would argue. So there's a whole wider context, just as you're describing, promotion, incentivization, that's really important. Claire, Bill, Jules, do you want to come in on this? Claire?
Yes, I think it's a really important point. And I also think it's one of these things that it's a difficult one, so it tends to get left to the bottom of the heap, because anything that attacks the private car or is seen to be inconveniencing the private car tends to be a bit of a problem for the local authorities. I'm sure you've seen the stories of quiet streets in urban areas where authorities who've just parachuted the idea in on an area get lambasted, whereas those who work well with the local community to talk about why it's useful actually see it adopted much more widely and with much more enthusiasm, because they can see what the point is. And I mean, Jules has talked about community engagement, as have we, and I think it's an important point that if you engage the local community with good reasons why that might be a nice thing to do, if it's a school walking route, for instance, or cycling route, having a really low speed limit will put drivers off going there, which is a good thing. So that's actually a safety issue. It's not just a transport issue. So this whole joined up policy issue, I think, makes a lot of sense. The other point I want to pick up on is that whole delivery issue. We've all seen the increase in delivery traffic now that we're supposed to have just-in-time delivery, and you call a cab to deliver you a sausage roll and a coffee nowadays, it seems. You can't even be bothered to go to the shops for that. And I think there needs to be a real focus on how we move large bulk freight around the country, because it makes no sense at all for the HGVs to be powering down local lanes. It's terrifying for people in any other form of traffic. So I think there's quite a lot of potential for something innovative there. And you see all this drone traffic stuff coming out where they're going to be dropping parcels on your head as you're walking in the house. I'm sure it'll all work perfectly well eventually, but I do think it's important that we look at everything from a much more rounded perspective than just how do you drive from A to B.
Super, thank you. Jules, did you want to come in here?
Yeah, I was firstly going to agree with Alison that I think road safety and speeds in rural areas are a huge issue here. And I'm speaking as someone who worked for Break, the road safety charity, for many years. So I know that this is a ubiquitous problem. And I know from experience supporting community rail groups that this is not just an inhibitor to walking and cycling, and I think that's well acknowledged by our partners in Active Travel on the Sustainable Transport Alliance. But it is also a major inhibitor to access to public transport. A lot of our members are grappling with issues about people not being able to get to railway stations on foot and bicycle due to a lack of safe infrastructure for walking and cycling. I know that in my village, a lot of the bus stops are actually very difficult to get to or wait at because of the speed and proximity of passing traffic. So I think this is an enormous problem, and I think it needs to be thought about, not just in a kind of blinkered way, thinking about getting more people walking and cycling, but in enabling wider access to public transport as well, and enabling communities to get greater use from and benefit from existing public transport assets. So yeah, I think that all needs joining up. And I was going to, I think Claire said it very well, that engagement of communities is absolutely critical to this, and putting communities in the driving seat of change, if you'll excuse the pun, as much as possible. I know that I'm a village councillor in an extremely car dependent rural community, and we have managed to we're progressing various improvements to Active Travel, which will connect our village up better with the local rail network. And there's been a real kind of groundswell of support and enthusiasm for making these improvements. As soon as you start exploring the benefits that the village can achieve, actually it kind of that shift in mindset that we really need away from, you know, we're all going to carry on driving everywhere forevermore. It just follows quite naturally. So I think that the more that we can empower communities to lead the change, the more that everything else kind of falls into place.
Thank you. It's interesting, isn't it? A lot of these ideas that we're starting to come up with here of demonstrator areas, of filtered permeability, of making bus stops accessible, of, you know, this is in a sense the urban playbook of perhaps 20 years ago, and a lot I think could learn a lot: rural logistics, urban logistics, and so on. Kate in the chat has made a very interesting point, building on yours, Alison, about filtered permeability, basically in urban language. There has to be quite a lot in that, I think. Jules, just come back to you for a second. Mark Hodgson will be speaking later, and I'm hoping, he says leadingly, that we can capture these things in the Miro boards as well later on. But he's talking about, you know, shared mobility operations and Network Rail train operating company kind of triangle. I can see you smiling. So Mark, you won't know, but Jules and I have been liaising quite a bit about this in the last few months and thinking, what could CRN and CoMo do together potentially to you know, to try and make this go better. But yes, Jules, any reaction, thoughts on that would be great.
I'm smiling because Network Rail always comes up somehow in these discussions. They're really critical, aren't they? We are doing a lot of work with Network Rail and other partners within the rail industry to try to help the rail industry to be more responsive to local needs and opportunities. We are aware that there are often difficulties faced by local communities wanting to engage with their rail. With the railways and to make changes at stations, etc. That is something that community rail can often help with. It's something our team can often help with at a local level. So do get in touch with us. Anyone who's facing these sorts of difficulties. You know, that's partly what community rail is here to do, is provide that bridge between the very, very complicated technical rail industry and local communities. So let us know if we can help, and hopefully things will shift and change with all the changes going on within the rail industry at the moment. We hope that, you know, that will help to make the industry a bit more community focused and a bit more responsive to local opportunities and needs, which would be, yeah, very beneficial.
Thank you, Jules, and Mark, I'm happy to make introductions offline if that's useful. I will move us on, but Bill, just check if there's anything you wanted to comment on here. All right, brilliant.
No, I think they've covered everything I would have said on the road stuff, so, and probably said more than I'd have said, so that's
nonsense.
Good with me.
All right, brilliant, thank you. Rob, could we turn to you, please? So Rob Dickin,
yeah. Brilliant. Can you hear me okay, Richard?
We can hear you, and yes, now we can see you. Excellent.
Perfect, brilliant, good. So thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. My name is Rob Dickin from Transport for the South East. I'm one of the transport strategy managers which have been involved in developing our transport strategy over the past couple of years. Just to, before I move on to some of the key elements which we feel are demonstrating problems and issues in rural communities, which has come through from our evidence finding as part of our transport strategy development, before moving on to some key actions which we feel need to be considered, and hopefully will generate some debate in the discussion groups a little bit later on as well. So just to give you a brief overview of Transport for the South East, so we cover the southeast, obviously, of England, and that's from Kent in the east over to Hampshire in the west, including the Isle of Wight, and then from the south coast all the way up to Surrey, bordering London, basically, and the Berkshire local transport authorities. And so what we've been doing over the past couple of years is to develop our transport strategy, which sets out our vision for 2050, where we want to be in 29 years' time. Sounds like a very long time, but actually, when you actually drill down, there's an awful lot to do in order to reach our ambition, which includes obviously decarbonisation and net zero by 2050 at the latest, hopefully that will move forward. But there's some significant challenges involved with that when we're looking at transport across the wider southeast. Rural mobility is a key concern, has been a key concern all the way through the development of our transport strategy, raised by our leaders and also our stakeholders as well. And part of that, some of those reasons, some of that evidence which has come through, obviously the poor provision of bus services and public transport in rural areas. It's not everywhere, but it's patchy. And obviously there's been a major funding issue around that. So, post 2010, the amount of supported services, being supported by local authorities to run to rural areas has diminished considerably. That's a key concern moving forward and has actually driven up car dependency in some of those areas. There's also a very, very strong correlation between poor connectivity and deprivation and social inequality. It feels like it's quite an obvious thing to say, but actually the evidence which comes through is clearly showing that those places that don't have connectivity to major economic hubs and London have more severe forms of deprivation and social inequality. And so there's a real issue there. If we want to balance up, which is really very much what this government is trying to do, it's not just between north and south, it's also across sub-regional areas as well, which we need to be very aware of. There's obviously, has been mentioned by some of the other panelists, a poor provision for active travel in rural areas. Some of that, I believe, is down to actually poor information and poor signposting. We do have a very good network of bridleways, but they're in very, very poor condition across a lot of our rural areas. So we need to start thinking about what we can do to improve and increase active travel in those areas. There's poor and inconsistent levels of digital connectivity. We all know, we're all increasingly connected, especially at the moment in this COVID pandemic. And actually, sort of when you look at 4G availability across a lot of our rural communities, it's very, very poor. And obviously that's been highlighted by the fact that a lot of people are trying to homeschool at the moment, and there's children who just don't have that digital connectivity, which is so fundamental to 21st century living. So I think that's a real issue which we need to be grappling with. There's a poor provision of essential services across rural communities. Again, it's patchy, but what that does is encourages those unnecessary journeys. And I'm talking about things like health. It's just basic, post offices, rural shops. There's a tendency to force people into their cars in order to travel around and to access these essential services. And I think there needs to be a key step change in how we think about that. I've already mentioned briefly about COVID, but obviously decarbonisation is the huge sort of juggernaut, if you like, trundling down towards us, which we need to deal with. And that's not going to go away. And I think it's exacerbated in rural areas. How do we encourage very car-dependent communities to switch to low carbon forms of transport, or even better, not to travel at all? So just very, very briefly, Transport for the South East, as well as our transport strategy, we're also developing a future mobility strategy, which is trying to grapple with some of these issues. And what that strategy is trying to do is to identify those demographics and place-based propensity to use new forms of mobility. And then, also most importantly, where they're likely to be used. So there potentially is a commercial case for those services to go into those rural communities. However, that's throwing things at a wall sometimes and hoping things will stick. And I think there needs to be a discussion around looking at what works where, and then what can we do across the private and the public sector to actually make these things happen. So just some key discussion points very quickly, because I know I'm already going over time. These things which I think are really, really crucial to this debate. Integrated transport and spatial planning is not going away. We've got a real, there's a potential here with all the new housing developments going in, that we're locking in car dependency in rural areas, again, for another generation, if not more. So we need to start thinking more holistically around where housing developments are going and how that links in with a sustainable transport network. All of those mobility solutions and services, which we'll be talking about in due course, must contribute and lead to net zero. There can't be any outliers which are just still carrying on pumping out carbon. They all need to contribute to net zero and our target for 2050 at the latest. There's a strong argument for a reduction in vehicle kilometres as well as a policy decision. And one of the ways through that, and obviously Richard is very keen on this, and people joining this seminar today, is around sharing transport services. So it's not just people jumping into their own cars, it's actually using community transport or mass transit or even other solutions, but sharing is really important. There must be integration between modes and mobility services. This siloed thinking, which we've got into in this country, around train, bus, car, has to go. We need to be thinking much more integrated, and that needs to be technological solutions as well. So mobility as a service has already been mentioned. Investment in digital infrastructure has to also be prioritised across rural communities, so that where possible we can avoid people making those unnecessary journeys. There is a risk here though. We don't want it to be seen, but people shouldn't be travelling at all in rural communities. So there needs to be a strong discussion point around, those essential services and how people access them. There needs to be good trials of future mobility services. And I think at the moment it's patchy. There's some pockets of very, very good practice already going on across the Southeast. And we need to make sure that there's opportunities to develop those further. And importantly, again, coming back to decarbonisation, is an agreed methodology which we can all work towards to measure our progress towards decarbonisation. And that needs to be at a national level, but also at a subnational level as well. So we're very keen to see government moving that forward, particularly through the Transport Decarbonisation Plan. And just finally, just very, very briefly, freight came up. Consolidation of freight and freight deliveries in rural communities is a massive issue. And the potential for mobility hubs to enable freight to be dropped off in local areas for people to then travel sustainably to pick those goods up is something which I think has got a lot of mileage, and we need to really consider thinking about. So that's gone over time, so apologies for that, Richard, but I hope that's some food for thought, and very happy to have any questions or comments, and happy to contribute to the breakout rooms a little bit later on as well. Thank you, Richard.
Rob, thank you very much for that. Great that sharing is in all forms is firmly part of the TFSE agenda. Talking of agendas, just to be clear, we don't have Naomi Green speaking today, sadly. She had to go into another meeting at very short notice just this morning. We are running a little bit late, but I would like to pause here just if there are any questions, thoughts, particularly to Rob. Otherwise, we shall move on. I'll give it a few seconds. Okay, in that case, let us move, if we may, into our operators section. And Kevin, if you are there, and
hi, Richard.
Step onto the stage, so to speak. Hello, great. Thank you.
Great. I will quickly do a screen share of a presentation, if you can bear with me. Yes. Should hopefully see Lift Tango up there. Just going to do a brief introduction to Lift Tango and some of the work we're doing in the sort of rural and regional parts of the UK and around the world. So, my name is Kevin Orr. I'm the CEO of Lift Tango. And we are a group of technology geeks, I suppose, that are producing solutions in the shared mobility space. So our vision is to unlock all the goods that comes from shared transport and make sustainable and meaningful connections through these engaging transportation platforms that optimize transport and combat climate change. So we've been doing this for about 4 years on the other side of the world, predominantly in Australia and New Zealand, more recently in North America, and we launched our first DRT project in August this year in the North Lincolnshire area in the UK. But we have staff all around the world. It's just a brief overview of where some of our projects are. We are extremely driven to solve, I guess, the transport problems in the more rural and regional and suburban parts of our world, our countries. The likes of Jane here, she should have the right to be able to live at home and have access to transport to move around, to see friends without having to drive a car. Lucas, similarly, is new to employment. He should be able to get to and from his work and start his kind of journey into a new career without having the headaches of transportation around him. And Ranald's getting to and from hospital appointments, regular hospital appointments, is a fundamental right that we should be working to secure for people in the communities. And some of the technologies we provide to help do this is our net zero carpool product. We have demand responsive transport solution for the general public, for public transport, but also community transport and corporate transport. And we work with a lot of organizations to do simulations. We find this is a key part of where you can make or break projects. And if you can design it right from the outset, you're pretty much there on having a successful project. And we find that there are a lot of assets around the rural and regional communities. I think the problem is they're just not leveraged as well as they could be. So you've got public transport, corporate transport, and community transport assets that have quite siloed use cases. And when they're not, I guess, having any trips during those use cases, they're just sitting there doing nothing. The value of having, I guess, a technology layer, demand responsive transport technology layer, is you can start to take these assets and use them more effectively.
Really sorry to butt in. I think we can hear someone in the background in the room you're in.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
It's just loud enough that it's sort of trampling what you're saying. So, yeah, sorry about that. If you could sort that, brilliant. Thank you. And I can't resist saying 3 minute warning, so to speak.
3 minute warning. Yeah, I've given the sign to talk quietly. Sorry about that, everyone.
Brilliant.
Okay, very quickly, I'll skip a couple of slides, but I just want to finish on talking about the North Lincolnshire project, if that's okay. It's one of the largest DRT projects in the UK. It's 515 square kilometres, so largest geographically. But it's very much about connecting people from a rural home or a rural site to other parts of the rural community or into the town centres. And there's an awful lot of fixed bus commercial services that run in and around these areas. And we're very careful and we have features to make sure we're not taking I guess passengers away from there. We're really working in with the existing infrastructures, connecting into those kind of economic hubs, those town centres, but ultimately getting people from what is a rural area into those centres for work, school, shopping, and it's a hybrid community transport / commercial service as well, which is fairly interesting concept as well. But I know my time is up, so I'll end there. Thank you very much. It's great to have shared that.
Kevin, thanks so much. Fascinating. Graham, over to you.
Well, great to be here. Great to actually be talking about rural problems as well, and yeah, lots of notes. So, we're Highcar. We've been trading for 5 years. We're the UK longest peer-to-peer car sharing platform, and for me, I live in a small community. There's 20 houses within a mile of where I live, and you know, through peer-to-peer ownership and sharing to actually decrease that ownership, it's kind of the only way we can kind of flip car usage on its head. 32 million cars currently sitting idle 96% of the time pre-COVID, so I imagine that's obviously a lot higher post-COVID. So one of the big problems for us was again, it was just people not having, they want to share cars, but they didn't have the platform or the insurance to do it. We also have features like mates rates, which means I can share my car to my neighbours. for basically nothing. It's just an insurance play. And I think us now leveraging or allowing community car clubs to actually leverage our insurance and our platform to actually get their local people and local community sharing is something that we're quite keen to keep pushing on doing. There are 28 million people currently in the UK within 2 miles for a hire car, but actually that's not quite good enough. To really get people out of their own car and using somebody else's car, you need to be a lot closer. We have around 8 million people in the UK that are within 1 mile of a hire car, and that's a good kind of proximity to get people sharing. COVID's been interesting. I think it's kind of definitely helped with the adoption of car sharing. You see that obviously people are financially now, I suppose, a little bit more in trouble, and actually people are looking at their cars for ways to sharing to make money, or actually getting rid of their cars completely and sharing their neighbours. I think with the adoption of electric car sharing, so one of our latest investors founded eCar Club. Infrastructure is obviously a huge problem. We don't want 32 million electric cars. Hopefully we get down to about 3 million electric cars. And I think where the rural area in particular is good for EV car sharing is that most houses have driveways for their own infrastructure to actually charge a vehicle. So actually some of the problems we see in urban areas, actually it's not the case in more rural areas. So that can really help with the adoption of EV car sharing. Conscious got 3 minutes, got so much I'd like to talk about. I really like Jules's point about technology isn't always the answer. So around 90% of our transactions before COVID were obviously done with without key handover in urban areas. But in rural areas, we actually see that lots of people, they don't want that technology. They actually really enjoy it, embracing meeting their neighbours, helping one another. So yeah, tech isn't always the answer. I think I'll keep it there. So I do just say the whole community aspect. We've had people that have gone to share their cars, but not actually done so, but have gone out for drinks again before COVID. We've had people that have managed to go to a job interview and get that job because they couldn't actually afford access. They couldn't afford their own car, but being able to hire a car for 3 or 4 hours, their neighbours, they could. So cars aren't the enemy. I think, if you're doing a journey under an hour, please use public transport, use a bike or walk. But for those journeys, 5-6 hours, you need a car. So let's do it in a shared way.
Graham, thank you. We've had DDRT and car sharing perspectives. Alex, let's come to you.
Morning, everyone. Tandem is another form of DRT, but I think quite a unique one, and one designed specifically for rural areas and smaller towns. And it's unique because we don't have dedicated vehicles operating our services. We partner with existing local licensed taxi companies and minibus companies to create this new form of DRT. So as with many DRT systems, passengers book their journey through an app. Fares are fixed. So this is not like some of the taxi sharing schemes you see in big cities where it's just about a cheaper taxi. This is very much more competing with or providing an alternative to buses. So you pay the same fare regardless of how many people you're sharing the vehicle with. Our technology then pulls passengers together, but then crucially, those journeys are then serviced by these local taxi and minibus companies. So if nobody books, 0 costs are incurred. And I think for rural areas in particular, that's absolutely crucial. So we're not block booking taxis. We book taxis as we go, automatically through the system. And so if nobody books, 0 costs are incurred. If 3 people book, then we send a 4-seater. If more than that, we send a larger vehicle. And we have that flexibility of tapping into those fleets that are already there within each community. So we can access supply at all times, but incur no cost for that supply when nobody's traveling. To date, we've been doing that mostly in partnership with private sector employers. based in rural areas where they're struggling to attract staff. So they're underwriting the services so that they can get people to their site. We're now doing that across Yorkshire, parts of Yorkshire, Lancashire, Cambridgeshire, Suffolk, Northamptonshire. And increasingly now we're looking at how we can expand that beyond those private sector partnerships to do this as part of the formal public transport network. So we are talking to local authorities about how we can replace existing heavily subsidised bus services in this way. So, for example, yesterday I had a conversation with a local authority where the average subsidy per passenger was between 40 and literally £253 per passenger journey. So obviously at that level of subsidy, you could send everyone their own taxi and still save the taxpayer a huge amount of money. Obviously, we'd be looking ultimately to save even more by pooling people together. We're also talking to some bus operators about blended models, where during peak hours, they still send a regular bus, which would then be pre-booked. But outside of those hours, if you were to pre-book, a local taxi would be dispatched instead. And I think there's something in that kind of blended model that is really exciting again for rural areas. And I've timed it exactly on 3 minutes, so I'll leave it there.
Alex wins the CoMoUK Rural Event Timing Award hands down. Super, thank you so much. And that's really interesting perspective. Thank you for that also. Lastly, could I call on Mark Hodgson of CoCars? And then we will have time for a little bit of Q&A on this operator section. Mark, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Okay, so first thing I guess differential for us is, so we're a car club, but we also provide bikes and electric cargo bikes. The key thing, I guess, from our perspective, we're a community-owned car club, so we're very much based in the community, and we've recently done a successful share offer with our communities. I think that's the difference from our perspective. So we're working with various different rural and city areas. We have partnerships with train companies, hence asking about the trains, where we're linking trains and bikes to the network, to the rural towns around, so creating that hub and spoke, and then looking at providing bikes, cars, and integrating with various different bus operators to provide that service. We also do just starting a peer-to-peer where we've had very much like, and I totally agree very much with Highcar, I think they're doing some great stuff, where we've had people who in the community have got an electric car, but it's not used very much, so that can come onto our platform to use that. But obviously we're seeing a lot of interest in people wanting electric cars and often can't afford to have access, can't pay for those electric cars, so we can provide that within our platform. So everything's booked online, very much as the standard sort of car club. But I guess we also provide other modes of transport. And I guess where we see is fitting this sort of hub and spoke approach out, because a lot of people obviously live in the community are effectively commuting to other locations, whether that's, and obviously we've also seen quite a difference in terms of the way people think they're going to travel. And I think that's something we need to consider going forward. Because obviously we now know that certain people are moving. Certainly we're based in Southwest, but we have other coverage areas. And we're certainly seeing a lot of people buying houses here, people who are not going to be commuting nowhere as much as they thought they would be doing. And obviously there's a change in demographic happening in some of those rural towns. So I think there's quite a big piece on that perspective. Yeah, and I think the other thing that we do is we work very much with other community groups. So whether they're land trusts, renewable energy companies, local communities, where we can join the community ownership together. And I think that's a really big thing, especially going forward in rurality. There's a lot more identity in rurality areas, and also a lot of how can we build the economy locally as well. So I think that's quite an important point to consider as well. So yeah, I thought I'll just keep it quite short because I know we're running a bit out of time. Okay, thank you.
Mark, thank you so much. That's really helpful and interesting, and very good to get your perspective. Just pause here for any questions for our operator speakers. I'll give it a little while. Otherwise, it will be our time to dive into the breakout.
I had one question, Richard.
Go for it.
It was just for Alex, actually, if I may, just around how how quickly can your service be deployed? I mean, how quickly can I get a vehicle from activating a request in a rural area if you've then got to tie up with a taxi company that may be several miles from where the person is?
So it depends a little bit on the setup in a particular geography. So right now with the, so actually a lot of our services, worth noting, are kind of semi-scheduled. So we can either do purely on demand, as you're talking about, in which case we'd be looking at 20 to 30 minutes potentially. But actually, in a lot of cases, the feedback we've had from users is that they like knowing the kind of bus schedule that they have at the moment. They like knowing that timetable. And so we're operating what we call, this might sound counterintuitive, but scheduled on demand. So the on-demand part is that we're only going to those stops where people have booked. And so therefore there's a saving there. We're not traveling, we're not sending vehicles at all if nobody's booked a journey. But we are still operating on that schedule where people are booking. And the big advantage, one of the other advantages, as well as passengers liking that, is from a pooling perspective, particularly in rural areas, you're massively increasing the chances of getting multiple people in the same vehicle. Whereas with these services, which are fantastic in theory, where you can kind of travel anywhere within a zone, the chances of, particularly in off-peak periods, getting multiple people in the same vehicle, which is obviously how you make these services come close to breaking even commercially, are really low. And so, yeah, having these kind of semi-schedules are part of how we counteract that.
Thanks.
Super, thank you. Let us move then, given time, to breakout rooms. Once my colleague Dave at CoMoUK splits us all up and sorts us all out, because I have to manually move the chairs around, we will then have the Miro board link popped up in the chat in that breakout room. But the chairs will also screen share the Miro board for anyone who's on a phone or on the wrong kind of browser or can't access it directly. So see you on the other side in a few seconds. That's all. Hi, everybody, and welcome back. Apologies to anyone that was a bit of a brutal return. We're still going strong on our board, but that's a good thing because you know, I'm really fired up and thankful for the quality of debate that we were getting there and all those points that we're able to capture. Thank you also to all our speakers for that range of perspectives we had too. We have a couple of minutes here for anyone who wants to come in with something they really feel has not been addressed. You know, they want to put into the debate here and have us capture. And otherwise, our plan to close out is for Claire Gregory from the DFT to reflect briefly on how this has landed with her, and then I'll wrap us up. So just pause here for a few seconds. Anyone welcome to come in? Otherwise, I will hand on to Claire.
Richard, can I ask a question?
Okay.
Sorry, you might be about to cover this, but I'm just interested to know what's going to happen with all the fantastic contributions that were made as part of the breakout groups, because certainly we would value seeing a lovely write-up of all of that, including to help us with our response that we're working on to the DFT consultation.
Yeah, sure. So I was going to cover it now. So we will sort of tidy those things up and group them and reflect across the 4 rooms. Obviously, I expect there's a lot of common threads. Then certainly with the Sustainable Transport Alliance members, such as CRN Jules, I was planning to send around a very rough key points type draft of what our call for evidence response would be. I think that's probably the best way of doing that will capture all these points. And we'll also try to do that within CoMo's own networks, depending on my somewhat limited bandwidth as we all pant our way through 2021. But we'll certainly do some sort of summation point around our stakeholders, including STA members, to hopefully in time to get some feedback the other way, so that we can then inform what we finally say. And just to flag, I will pop my email in the chat box here, which I was going to do at the end. I'm more than happy to get people's perspectives, to fix up a chat, to get input offline as well. Thank you for the question. Claire, I'll hand on to you to just briefly give us a flavour of how this has all gone for you. What's struck you, whatever you want to cover, and then I'll close this out. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. And yeah, thank you everybody so much for your participation this morning, for the speakers, really interesting insights, and the group that I was sitting in on as well. Fantastic to hear all your ideas, and looking forward to seeing all the other Miro boards as well and hearing how the other discussions went. I think just a quick reflection, a couple of things that have really stood out for me, and amongst everything, so much food for thought. The first is around thinking about the whole and how we can maximise what is there already. There's so many great services, as we've heard about, across different rural communities. So how can we kind of maximise those and make sure those learnings are translated across to other areas? And yeah, just thinking about some of the simple things, like how to increase access to bus stops and things like that, not to overlook those, which I think is really important. But also thinking about the local as well, and the importance of working with local places and really involving local communities. And I know this is something that the Minister has raised with us as well. So yeah, really great to hear some ideas around that, and lots for us to take away and think about how we can integrate into the strategy. Yeah, so thank you so much, everybody, again. It's been super helpful, and yeah, it's really encourage you to take the time to respond. Grateful for all input possible. And someone mentioned a very detailed response earlier, and detailed response is fine. We'll be reading all of it with interest. So thank you very much again.
Super. Thank you, Claire, for being part of this. Much appreciated. And I will just briefly close this out by making the point, which is probably a very obvious one, but any call for evidence or consultation response, which is what we're gearing up to here, and encouraging all of you to put in as well, just as Claire was just saying, that's obviously only actually the start. That's not the finish. And so once we have that into the department, we'll then be engaging with them, just as we are in an ongoing way with the future transport agenda, the decarbonisation plan in particular, alongside the sort of day job stuff, if you like, the current stuff around shared bike share, car share, and so on. We have a minister in post at the moment who has an awareness of shared transport, sees it as part of her remit, also has a rural constituency. So I'm hopeful that as we build towards potential legislation around future transport, potentially next year, we would see there to be some rural aspects of that. I think all too easy for rural to be the forgotten area, and we very much don't want that to happen. So thank you all. Thank you to all our contributors, all our speakers. Antonia, thank you, has magically flung up my email address on there, and our site, which has areas dedicated to community schemes, also to mobility hubs, which might be of interest. Do drop me a line if you'd like to. And my sincere thanks again. I think this has been really rich debate, and we look forward to talking with you all soon. Thanks, and bye-bye.